North Africa, a land of burning horizons where mirages twist the air and steel rusts before noon. In June 1940, Italy joined Hitler's war. From its colonies in Libya, Mussolini looked east toward Egypt and the jewel of the British Empire, the Suez Canal. Take Suez, he thought, and Britain's lifeline to India would snap. When war erupted in Europe, few believed these sands would matter. To Hitler they were a distraction, a sideshow. To Mussolini they were destiny, a chance to rebuild the Roman Empire beneath a new banner of fascism. On paper, the Italian 10th Army was formidable. 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, squadrons of aircraft. But numbers lie. Most tanks were slow relics, radios unreliable, fuel scarce, and the desert would expose every weakness. In September 1940, the Italians advanced across the frontier cautiously, almost timidly. For a few weeks it looked like success. Then they stopped. No water, no petrol, no plan. And the desert waited. Opposite them, a small British Commonwealth force under General Richard O'Connor watched and waited. In December, O'Connor struck. Operation Compass. What began as a 10-day raid became a 500-mile rout. Italian positions collapsed one after another. By February 1941, 130,000 prisoners filled desert cages. Entire divisions vanished. Mussolini's dream of empire was in ruins. Opposite them, a small British Commonwealth force under General Richard O'Connor watched and waited. In December, O'Connor struck. Operation Compass. What began as a 10-day raid became a 500-mile rout. Italian positions collapsed one after another. By February 1941, 130,000 prisoners filled desert cages. Entire divisions vanished. Mussolini's dream of empire was in ruins. Rome called Berlin for help. Reluctantly, Hitler agreed. He called it a holding mission, just enough troops to save face. But the man he sent would turn it into legend. February 1941. Erwin Rommel arrived in Africa and found chaos. His orders were defensive, his instincts were not. Within days he struck. The British, spread thin after sending troops to Greece, never saw it coming. In 2 weeks, Rommel retook the territory Italy had lost. His advance was reckless, improvisational, brilliant. He pushed the British all the way back to Tobruk, a fortress port on the Libyan coast. Tobruk refused to fall. Rommel was never meant to conquer Africa. His orders were to defend, to stabilize Italy's crumbling front. But ambition is a powerful fuel. Victories came easily at first, and each success convinced him that the desert could be mastered, that speed and will could outrun distance and dust. In the spring of 1942, he prepared for one final gamble. The British were rebuilding in secret. The Americans were supplying them through the Red Sea. Yet Rommel still believed one more strike could reach Cairo before reinforcements arrived. His panzers swept east again, the horizon boiling with heat. Columns of trucks bounced across endless dunes, engines screaming in the sand. In June, his forces crashed through the British defenses at Gazala. Tobruk, the fortress that had mocked him for a year, fell in a single day. In Berlin, church bells rang. Hitler promoted him to field marshal, the youngest in the German army. For a moment it seemed the path to Egypt was open, but every kilometer gained stretched his supply lines thinner. Fuel that began the journey in Italy was already half evaporated by the time it reached the front. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the air. The Royal Navy prowled the sea lanes. Rommel reached the small railway halt of El Alamein, barely 60 miles from Alexandria. Beyond that lay the Nile, the Suez Canal, and victory. But El Alamein was more than a point on the map. It was a wall of British resolve, rebuilt under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was careful, methodical, patient. He studied the mistakes of his predecessors and refused to be drawn into Rommel's dance of speed. While Rommel's fuel tanks dried up, Montgomery stockpiled. He gathered American Shermans, British Grants, thousands of guns and miles of pipeline carrying fuel straight to the front. Rommel attacked first in July, desperate to break through before the build-up was complete. He threw everything he had into the northern flank. It failed. The British minefields were too deep, their artillery too heavy. For weeks, the front simmered, both sides waiting for the next blow. In late October 1942, the desert exploded. Montgomery opened with a barrage of 1,000 guns. The night turned to day as the Eighth Army advanced, creeping forward behind curtains of smoke and fire. Rommel's men fought savagely, but there was no fuel to maneuver, no reserves to replace the dead. Tanks ran dry in the middle of battle. The Afrika Korps, once famed for its mobility, was forced to fight like infantry. Hitler radioed, "You must stand fast, win or die." Rommel knew it was madness. He replied quietly, "We are soldiers, not suicides." After 12 days of relentless fighting, Rommel ordered the retreat. What began as a fighting withdrawal turned into a desperate flight westward across hundreds of miles of barren ground. Columns of trucks snaked through dust and darkness, hunted from the air. Behind them, Montgomery's forces advanced methodically, reclaiming the towns that had fallen 2 years earlier: Mersa Matruh, Benghazi, Tripoli. The Eighth Army had learned from the Desert Fox and now used his own tactics against him. In the ruins of Tobruk, German soldiers burned what fuel remained so it would not fall into British hands. Across the Mediterranean, Hitler raged and promised reinforcements that would never come. The truth was simple: the Reich could not feed every front. Russia consumed men by the million, and the skies over Europe demanded new aircraft daily. North Africa, once an adventure, was now a burden. Rommel's army staggered into Tunisia in early 1943, reduced and exhausted. There a new enemy awaited. In the west, the Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch had opened a second front, and the noose began to tighten. From east and west, the Allies closed in. British and American forces advanced through mountain passes, cutting off supply routes and seizing ports. German engineers mined the roads, fought delaying actions, built desperate fortifications, but every retreat shortened their line and compressed their fate. By March 1943, Rommel was ill and disillusioned. He returned to Germany on sick leave, leaving his men to fight on under General von Arnim. He would never see Africa again. The final act came in May. Allied forces converged on Tunis. The last pockets of resistance collapsed under bombardment. 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms, more than at Stalingrad. For the men of the Afrika Korps, the war was over. They marched into captivity, gaunt, sunburned, beaten but unbroken. The desert that had once been their ally had swallowed them whole. With the fall of Africa, Hitler's dream of empire beyond Europe died. The Mediterranean was open. The Allies would soon invade Sicily, then Italy itself. The road to Berlin began not in France or Russia, but here, beneath the African sun. The war that Hitler called a sideshow had become the graveyard of his pride. And as the desert winds erased the tracks of tanks and men, they left behind a single truth: no empire, no matter how powerful, can conquer the endless sand. When the guns fell silent in Tunisia, Allied soldiers looked across miles of wrecked machines scattered like bones. The desert was quiet again, but the victory meant more than a line on a map. It was proof that the Axis could be beaten on land, and that the myth of German invincibility was finished. For Britain, it was redemption. After years of retreat, they had driven the enemy out of Africa. For the Americans, it was a beginning, their first major campaign against Nazi Germany. For Hitler, it was humiliation. He had lost 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and control of the southern Mediterranean. The triumph opened the sea lanes through the Suez Canal and secured the oil routes to the Middle East. Allied convoys could now flow freely to the Persian Gulf and India. The victory also gave the Allies something they had not felt in years: momentum. From captured ports in North Africa, Allied bombers now struck Italy and southern Germany. Engineers built new airfields overnight. The once remote desert outposts became launch pads for the next invasion: Sicily in July 1943. The war that began in sand was about to leap to Europe itself. But behind the triumph lay darker stories. Across Africa, hundreds of thousands of local soldiers had fought and labored for the empires that ruled them. Men from Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, and South Africa marched, dug trenches, and died far from home. Their courage was real, yet their names rarely appeared in newspapers. After the war, Many of these veterans returned to find their homelands unchanged, still colonies, still unequal. But they had seen the weakness of the old powers. They had fought beside Europeans and learned that empires were not immortal. Out of those memories, new independence movements were born. In Ethiopia, Haile Selassie restored his throne and became a symbol of African resistance. In West Africa, returning soldiers spoke of freedom and dignity. Across the continent, the idea spread that if Africa could help defeat fascism, it could also free itself from colonial rule. For Germany, the defeat in Africa was a warning unheeded. Hitler blamed the Italians, the weather, even Rommel's caution, but never his own strategy. He called Rommel home, later turning against him completely after the failed plot of 1944. The desert fox would die by his own hand, forced to drink poison to save his family. When the news reached his old soldiers, many refused to believe it. To them he remained the commander who shared their thirst, their dust, their danger. The man who had driven through fire until the war consumed him. Today the rusting hulls of tanks still lie half buried under the African sun. Time has softened the scars of battle, but the echoes remain. The war in Africa was not just a contest of armies, it was a struggle of endurance, of will, of men against an unforgiving world. In the end, Hitler's laughter at Britain's desert army became silence. The same sands that once carried his banners carried them away. And from that silence rose a new tide, one that would roll north across the sea, through Italy, and finally into the heart of Germany itself. When the war finally ended in 1945, the veterans of North Africa scattered back to every corner of the world. Some went home as heroes, others were forgotten, but all of them carried the memory of the desert, its silence, its cruelty, and the comrades they left behind. For many soldiers, the desert had been their first taste of global war. It was where they learned that courage often meant endurance, not glory. They had fought not for conquest, but to survive heat, thirst, and fear that no medal could describe. Across Britain and the Commonwealth, newspapers celebrated victory in Africa as the moment the tide had turned. The phrase, "Before Alamein we never had a victory," became part of history. The men of the 8th Army wore it like a badge of pride. In the United States, the campaign forged a generation of young commanders, Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley, who would later storm Normandy. Africa was their classroom, a place where they learned how to fight a modern war against a ruthless enemy. In Germany, the defeat was buried under propaganda. Hitler spoke little of Africa. He called it a distraction, a waste of resources, but those who had served there knew the truth. The desert had drained his strength long before the snows of Russia finished the job. Italy's empire in Africa vanished overnight. Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia were lost. Mussolini's dream of a new Rome ended in ruin. The same people Italy had tried to rule now watched the empire collapse and whispered that perhaps the Europeans were not invincible after all. In Africa itself, memory worked differently. For decades, villages remembered the foreign uniforms, the endless convoys, and the strange languages of war. Graves of African soldiers dotted the landscape, their names carved in stone, their stories rarely told. After independence, historians began to rediscover these forgotten campaigns. They found diaries, letters, and photographs of African troops marching through sandstorms under foreign flags. The story of World War II was larger than Europe. It was global, and Africa was one of its beating hearts. Today, travelers still find rusted helmets half buried in dunes, skeletons of trucks consumed by salt and wind. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its proof. Every grain of sand has witnessed empires rise, burn, and fade to dust. The war in Africa was more than strategy and maps. It was a warning about pride, about what happens when leaders believe geography will obey them. The desert obeys no one. It listens, waits, and then erases. From the fall of Tobruk to the surrender in Tunisia, the campaign lasted less than 3 years, yet in that short span, it reshaped the course of the Second World War. It taught the Allies how to win, and showed the Axis how easily their myths could die. Out of the heat and chaos came lessons written in sand and blood, that victory demands humility, that nature is a greater enemy than any nation, and that every soldier, whatever his uniform, shares the same thirst for home. The desert is quiet now. The wind moves softly over the dunes, carrying no sound of engines, no voices calling for water. But beneath that silence sleeps the story of how arrogance met endurance, and how a so-called sideshow changed the fate of the world. Hitler once laughed at Britain's desert army. He no longer could. Those same soldiers crossed the sea from Africa to Sicily, from Sicily to Italy, and step by step to the heart of Germany. The laughter ended in the rubble of Berlin. So when the sun sets over the North African horizon, and the shadows stretch across the sand, they fall upon ground where the course of history turned. The desert remembers, even if the world forgets.